Welcome to topic 4202 on global climate governance and international cooperation. This presentation examines how the world organizes collective action on climate change through treaties, institutions, reporting systems, finance, market mechanisms, and broader ideas of justice. Climate change is a problem that crosses borders, sectors, and generations, so no single government can solve it alone. That is why international cooperation matters, but it is also why climate governance is difficult. Countries have different responsibilities, capabilities, and development priorities. In this session, we will move from the overall governance architecture to the concrete mechanisms of the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. We will then connect these institutional designs to current debates on reform, transparency, climate finance, carbon market governance, sustainable development, and climate justice, including implications for urban resilience and long-term collaborative action. The agenda follows a clear evidence-based sequence. We begin by asking why global climate governance is so challenging in the first place. From there, we examine the institutional architecture built under the UNFCCC and the way COP decisions are translated into action. Next, we review major milestones, including the Bali Roadmap, and then study the Kyoto Protocol as an example of a more top-down model with binding targets, compliance rules, and market-based flexibility mechanisms. We then shift to the Paris Agreement and its more iterative logic centered on nationally determined contributions, transparency, and the global stocktake. After that, we discuss regime complexity, reform debates, and regional initiatives such as the European Green Deal. Finally, we look at climate finance, carbon markets, and a case study linking carbon governance with questions of sustainable development, equity, and climate justice. The learning objectives guide the entire lecture. First, you should be able to define the basic concepts and frameworks of global climate governance and international cooperation. Second, you should be able to describe the core goals and principles of major agreements, especially the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Third, you should understand how UNFCCC mechanisms and regional initiatives such as the European Green Deal can support sustainable development and urban resilience. Fourth, you should identify the roles of climate finance, carbon markets, and national commitments, including NDCs, in pursuing climate targets. Finally, the topic aims to build awareness of global environmental responsibility and the value of collaborative action. As we move through the presentation, each section connects back to one or more of these outcomes so that the lecture is conceptually coherent and practically useful. International climate cooperation is hard because it must solve more than one problem at the same time. On one level, climate stability is a global public good, which creates incentives for free riding. Every country benefits if emissions fall, but each government may prefer others to bear more of the near-term political and economic costs. On another level, climate governance is also shaped by fairness and development tensions. Countries differ in historical responsibility, present capacity, exposure to impacts, and priorities for growth and poverty reduction. These differences affect debates over targets, finance, technology transfer, and adaptation support. Monitoring and enforcement are also costly and politically sensitive. For that reason, climate governance has not evolved into one perfectly unified system. Instead, it has developed as a layered and sometimes fragmented field in which treaties, institutions, regional initiatives, and non-state actors all play partial roles. The overall architecture of climate governance is best understood as multi-level. At the center sits the UNFCCC, which provides the umbrella forum and institutional structure for negotiation, rule development, and periodic review. Under that umbrella sit the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, each with a different governance logic. Around them we find regional initiatives, national laws, city-level strategies, private sector commitments, and civil society networks. This matters because implementation does not happen only in global meetings. International agreements create expectations, procedures, and coordination mechanisms, but actual progress depends on how these are translated into domestic policy, financing decisions, infrastructure planning, and social practice. For urban resilience in particular, the connection between global frameworks and local action is essential. Cities often experience climate risks most directly, yet the enabling resources and norms may come from national commitments, regional strategies, and UNFCCC-linked processes. A useful way to understand COP governance is to see it as a cycle rather than a one-time diplomatic event. Negotiation produces COP, CMA, or CMP decisions, which then influence domestic law, policy, targets, budgets, and implementation plans. Those national actions are reported back through agreed procedures, reviewed by experts or peers, and fed into further rounds of negotiation. In the Paris system, this cycle is especially important because ambition is expected to rise over time through learning, transparency, and political pressure rather than through one fixed top-down target architecture. The cycle therefore links negotiation, implementation, reporting, and revision. This helps explain why transparency rules matter so much. They are not merely technical exercises. They support trust, comparability, accountability, and the possibility of increasing ambition. In other words, climate governance works not only through formal commitments but also through repeated institutionalized feedback between domestic and international levels. Several milestones help explain how this system evolved. In 1992, the UNFCCC established the basic legal and institutional foundation for international cooperation on climate change. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol added binding targets for industrialized countries and created specific market mechanisms. The Marrakesh Accords later clarified detailed rules, including compliance arrangements and implementation guidance. In 2007, the Bali Roadmap set out a structured pathway for negotiating the next phase of cooperation. In 2015, the Paris Agreement marked a major design shift by adopting a universal framework based on nationally determined contributions, transparency, and periodic collective assessment. More recently, the global stocktake has reinforced the logic of reviewing aggregate progress and signaling the need for stronger action. Looking at these milestones together shows that climate governance has moved from early framework building, to detailed rulemaking, to a more iterative and widely participatory model of ambition and implementation. The Bali Roadmap is important because it illustrates how climate diplomacy often advances through negotiated roadmaps rather than final solutions. Agreed at COP13 in 2007, it created a timetable and political framework for the next phase of negotiations after the first commitment period under Kyoto. What made Bali significant was not that it solved all major disputes, but that it organized them into a process that kept multilateral negotiations moving. Debates over ambition, responsibility, and differentiation remained intense, especially regarding how much developed countries should cut emissions and what role developing countries should play. Language around deep emissions reductions was politically contested, and compromises were necessary to preserve consensus. Bali therefore shows both the strengths and limits of COP diplomacy. It can generate momentum, structure expectations, and maintain dialogue, but it often does so through carefully balanced formulations that postpone some of the hardest distributive conflicts. The Kyoto Protocol represents the classic top-down model of climate governance. It established binding quantitative emission targets for Annex I parties, organized around commitment periods, and relied on accounting and reporting rules to track performance. A major feature of Kyoto was its use of flexibility mechanisms. These included emissions trading, joint implementation, and the clean development mechanism. The basic idea was that countries could meet part of their obligations more cost-effectively by using market-based tools, while still maintaining an overall cap for covered parties. Kyoto was significant because it translated broad climate cooperation into detailed legal commitments and operational rules. At the same time, its architecture also exposed political and practical challenges. Binding targets were concentrated on a subset of countries, participation remained uneven, and effective governance depended heavily on how well reporting, accounting, compliance, and market integrity were designed and enforced. Compliance became central under Kyoto because a system of binding targets only works if parties believe the rules are meaningful. The Marrakesh Accords created an institutional compliance structure, including a compliance committee with facilitative and enforcement-oriented functions. This design reflected an important governance logic. Climate agreements need both support and consequences. Facilitative elements help countries understand requirements, improve implementation, and resolve problems before they escalate. Enforcement-related measures matter because they protect credibility, especially when market participation or accounting eligibility is at stake. If countries can benefit from emissions trading without meeting reporting or methodological standards, trust in the system weakens. Kyoto therefore invested heavily in compliance design compared with later models. This does not mean compliance was perfect, but it does show that international climate governance can develop detailed procedural consequences when states are willing to accept them. The bigger question is whether such designs remain politically feasible at broader global scale. An important lesson from the Kyoto experience is that compliance is not shaped only by punishment. Rules work through incentives, reputational considerations, administrative routines, and access to benefits. For example, eligibility to participate in market mechanisms can encourage parties to maintain credible inventories and reporting systems. International scrutiny can also matter because governments do not want to be seen as systematically disregarding agreed rules. In addition, accounting procedures themselves influence behavior by defining what counts, how performance is measured, and what must be documented. This broader view of compliance is useful because it connects legal design to political economy. It also helps us interpret current carbon market debates. Market instruments can improve flexibility and reduce costs, but only when governance systems are robust enough to prevent weak accounting, double counting, and low integrity credits. In that sense, compliance is not a separate issue from markets. It is one of the conditions that determines whether market-based cooperation is credible and effective. The shift from Kyoto to Paris marks a major transformation in climate governance design. Kyoto relied more heavily on top-down targets for a defined group of industrialized countries. Paris, by contrast, is universal in participation and is built around nationally determined contributions, which each party prepares and updates according to its own national circumstances. This does not mean Paris is weak by definition. Rather, it uses a different logic. Instead of centrally allocating binding targets to a limited set of countries, it seeks progression over time through transparency, review, and repeated pledge cycles. The underlying assumption is that broad participation is more likely when countries retain flexibility over domestic pathways, while international institutions focus on information, comparability, and collective pressure. This design is more facilitative and politically adaptive, but it also raises questions about whether ambition will rise quickly enough. That is why NDC cycles, transparency rules, and stocktake processes are so important in the Paris system. The Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF, is sometimes described as the plumbing of the Paris Agreement because it connects commitments to information and learning. Under this framework, parties submit biennial transparency reports that describe emissions, progress on NDC implementation, and, where relevant, support provided or received. These reports are subject to technical expert review, and the results also enter a peer-oriented process known as the facilitative, multilateral consideration of progress. The overall aim is not punitive enforcement in the Kyoto sense, but a shared system for improving data quality, comparability, and confidence in reported progress. This matters for trust among parties, but it also matters for domestic governance because reporting requirements encourage institutional capacity building. The ETF further supports the global stocktake by generating the information base needed to assess collective progress. In short, transparency under Paris is not just about disclosure, it is an enabling mechanism for coordination, ambition, and policy learning. Even so, transparency should not be treated as a magical solution. Better reporting and review can strengthen trust, improve comparability, and reveal where implementation is lagging, but they do not automatically produce higher ambition. Political economy still matters. Governments may face domestic resistance, fiscal constraints, institutional weakness, or competing priorities that limit their ability to strengthen NDCs. Transparency also works unevenly depending on state capacity, data systems, and the willingness of actors to respond to public or diplomatic pressure. For that reason, a realistic interpretation is that transparency is necessary but not sufficient. It creates conditions for learning and accountability, yet stronger ambition also depends on finance, technology, leadership, coalition building, and broader social demand. This is an important takeaway for students of climate governance. Institutional design can improve the quality of international cooperation, but institutions operate within wider political and developmental contexts. Ambition grows when information is combined with incentives, capacity, and strategic coordination. Reform debates around the UNFCCC ask whether the system is fully fit for purpose in an era where implementation urgency is growing. Critiques often focus on slow procedures, consensus bottlenecks, overloaded agendas, and the influence of vested interests. Yet recent scholarship suggests that procedural reform alone may not be enough. If powerful actors benefit from delay or diluted outcomes, changing meeting formats or timelines will not solve the deeper problem. A more useful reform agenda looks at how institutional changes might create ripple effects across governance levels, opening space for new coalitions, more ambitious actors, and reinforcing dynamics sometimes described as green spiraling. This perspective is helpful because it treats climate governance as a dynamic political field rather than a static legal machine. It also explains why reform efforts often extend beyond the formal UNFCCC arena and include partnerships, sectoral coalitions, subnational initiatives, and issue-specific institutions that can complement, pressure, or accelerate intergovernmental processes. The concept of a regime complex helps explain why climate governance often looks like a patchwork rather than a neat hierarchy. A regime complex is a set of partially overlapping institutions, rules, and actors that are not fully centralized under one authority. In climate politics, this includes the UNFCCC system, regional policies, development finance institutions, trade-related measures, city networks, corporate initiatives, and many other arrangements. This fragmentation can be frustrating because it may create gaps, duplication, and coordination problems. However, it can also create flexibility, experimentation, and multiple entry points for action. When comprehensive agreement is difficult, smaller or partial institutions may still move specific issues forward. The challenge is therefore not simply to eliminate complexity, but to manage it. Effective governance in a regime complex depends on coordination, coherence, and the ability to connect local, national, regional, and international action without assuming that one institution alone can solve every dimension of the climate problem. The European Green Deal is a useful regional example because it shows how climate governance can be strengthened outside the global treaty core while still complementing it. As a broad policy package, it links decarbonization with industrial transformation, energy transition, finance, innovation, and just transition concerns. In governance terms, it demonstrates how regional frameworks can convert climate commitments into more concrete sectoral strategies, legislative proposals, and investment signals. This matters for sustainable development and urban resilience because many climate outcomes depend on transport systems, building standards, energy infrastructure, land use, and social policy, areas where regional coordination can be powerful. The Green Deal also shows that regional action can produce spillover effects beyond its territory through standards, trade relations, and policy diffusion. In that sense, global climate governance is not only about what happens inside COP negotiations. It is also about how regional initiatives create implementation momentum, shape expectations, and influence wider governance landscapes. Climate finance and carbon markets are often presented as enablers because they can mobilize resources, lower costs, and support implementation where public budgets alone are insufficient. Finance matters because ambition without investment is unlikely to succeed, especially in countries facing development constraints or high adaptation needs. Carbon markets matter because, in principle, they can direct funding toward lower cost mitigation opportunities and stimulate international cooperation. But both finance and markets carry risks. Poorly governed systems may reinforce inequality, generate low integrity outcomes, or prioritize accounting gains over real transformation. Lessons from the Kyoto mechanisms are therefore highly relevant to contemporary debates around Article 6 and cooperative approaches. Strong governance requires clear rules, transparent accounting, safeguards against double counting, and attention to sustainable development impacts. The broader point is that finance and markets are tools, not ends in themselves. Their value depends on institutional design, oversight capacity, and how well they align with equity and development objectives. The case of clean development mechanism projects in China helps connect carbon market governance to climate justice. The central question is not only whether projects generated tradable credits, but also who benefited, under what conditions, and with what local developmental effects. Research on CDM implementation shows that local capacity, institutional design, and governance safeguards strongly influence distributional outcomes. When governance is weak, benefits may be uneven, local participation limited, and sustainable development claims difficult to substantiate. This does not mean market mechanisms are inherently unjust. Rather, it shows that justice cannot be treated as an automatic co-benefit. It must be built into project selection, monitoring, stakeholder engagement, and benefit-sharing arrangements. For urban resilience and sustainable development, this lesson is especially important. Climate instruments should not be judged only by aggregate emissions logic. They should also be assessed by how they affect communities, local priorities, and the fairness of transition pathways in practice. To conclude, global climate governance is best understood as an evolving combination of treaties, procedures, finance, markets, and normative commitments. The Kyoto Protocol demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of a binding target model supported by detailed compliance rules and market mechanisms. The Paris Agreement represents a more universal but also more iterative architecture based on NDCs, transparency, and periodic collective assessment. Neither model solves the politics of climate cooperation on its own. Regime complexity is therefore likely to persist, making coordination across institutions and levels of governance a central challenge. Regional initiatives such as the European Green Deal, along with finance and carbon market arrangements, can support implementation, but only if they are designed with integrity and fairness in mind. The final takeaway is ethical as well as institutional. Effective climate governance requires shared responsibility, sustained cooperation, and a commitment to ensuring that climate action also advances justice, sustainable development, and resilience.